pass over to you, Maya and Helen.
We're here to talk about the petition campaign, which we launched towards the end of last week. And I'm going to talk you through it. I'll talk you through why this petition, why this specific ask, what's it for, what will it achieve if we manage to get the debate in Parliament and we manage to get the policy that we're asking for passed, how we're planning to do it, and what we want you to do. Will you help us? And we want sort of questions, ideas, criticism, enthusiasm, all of that. Firstly, why this petition? And so this is the campaign briefing, which we haven't published yet. You're getting a sneak peek of it, as to why we decided that this is the thing, this is the big thing that we're asking for. It's about the Equality Act, and we think the law should be simple and clear enough for everyone to understand. So all of the questions about single-sex services need to be understood by every kind of service provider, the pubs, cafes, gyms, the 18-year-old receptionist, the child, the woman who doesn't speak English as first language. It just has to be really clear and simple for everyone to understand. The EHRC came out with guidance on the single-sex services, which was pretty good from a legal point of view, but impossible from an understanding point of view. And we started thinking that you need to be able to explain this stuff with pictures. So we're going to try and explain it with pictures. The Equality Act protects people against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and harassment, as I think hopefully most people know. Direct discrimination is when you're treated differently because you have a protected characteristic. Indirect discrimination is where you're treated the same. So the organization has policy that treats everyone the same, but it disadvantages a group with a protected characteristic. And the difference between direct discrimination and indirect discrimination is that it's harder to win a case of indirect discrimination because the organization can justify the rule. They can say it's a proportionate means to a legitimate aim. And so the question of whether something is direct or indirect discrimination matters a lot. But it's only something really that the lawyers understand. It's not something that you can explain as a service provider. And then the third one is harassment. So unwanted conduct that makes it an intimidating or hostile environment, and that there's a separate line for sexual harassment, so unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. And all of those things, you need to be able to explain them in clear language. There we go. So there are 9 protected characteristics, and that's pretty simple. We can explain that. Sex and gender reassignment are 2 separate characteristics. Pregnancy and maternity is a separate characteristic. Sexual orientation is. Those are pretty simple. And so in a discrimination case where it's sex discrimination, the comparator, so the person, when you're saying I'm being treated differently compared to somebody who doesn't have this protected characteristic, if it's sex discrimination, the comparator is a man. Straightforward, right? And so if it's a gender reassignment discrimination case, the comparator is a person who doesn't have that protected characteristic, who isn't transsexual. So if it's a male transsexual, someone who calls himself a trans woman, then the comparator should be a male who's not a trans woman, who calls himself a man. It shouldn't be that a trans woman is compared to a woman, but almost nobody knows this. Judges don't know this. The judges are told, to use the language of trans woman, and so they get confused, and they think that you must treat someone who identifies as a trans woman as if they were a woman. That's the discrimination question. And then there are the exceptions, as we know, the exceptions to the Equality Act, which allow you to discriminate. They allow you to have sex-based rules, and that's lawful. So you can have a single-sex service when it's allowed to be used by only when it's only needed for people of one sex, or when there's bodily contact involved, or bodily privacy, or when it's in a hospital. And one of the conditions is where a joint service is not as effective. And that just means, you know, where you could have it as a mixed service, but it's less effective. And that's the one really that applies to most everyday services like toilets and changing rooms. You know, you could have a unisex toilet, but it's more effective to have separate sex toilets because it's cleaner, it's more privacy. It's not saying you can never have unisex toilets, but it's justified to have separate sex toilets for just completely ordinary everyday reasons. And so that's the Equality Act, and it makes sense if you remember who's a man and who's a woman, and if you're able to say who's a man and who's a woman. And those rules should be able to be clearly explained, you know, to avoid conflict, and to avoid putting people in situations that they will perceive and experience as sexual harassment. You know, a man in a women's changing room or a man in a women's shower. You need to have clear rules and policies and signage that everyone understands. And the EHRC has gone as far as saying this. I think the most important thing in their new guidance was saying, have a policy, write it down, be clear. Because as soon as you write down what the policy is, then it forces you to say, are we allowing some men into this women's space, or are we actually not going to allow any men into this women's space, including men who think they're women? So writing it down and not being ambiguous is what allows single sex services and spaces to be protected. The rules, the signs need to be able to be understood by everyone, but you know, the guidance is pretty incomprehensible, and that's a problem. And then the big problem is, what if somebody has a gender recognition certificate? What if someone is male, identifies as a woman, changes their legal sex via a gender recognition certificate? What does that do to the system of discrimination protections, comparators and rules and language? It completely messes it up. So if a person is legally female, even though they're biologically male, are they, what's the comparator in a discrimination case? When they read that sign that says female, are they allowed in or are they not? When you ring up on the phone and say, is this a single sex service? And they say yes or they say no, do they mean because of biology or because of what's on a birth certificate? And nobody really knows the answer to all of that. There are lawyers who will say on one side, a gender recognition certificate changes your sex for all purposes, including the Equality Act. And there are lawyers who say it doesn't. And we think it needs to be clear. So basically that's the petition, is asking the government to make clear that sex, the protected characteristic of sex in the Equality Act, means biological sex. It means the sex you were born and your biology stays the same, and it's not modified by a gender recognition certificate. And so if you've seen the petition, I think many people hopefully have seen it and signed it already. It's got this bit in it. It says the government must exercise its powers under Section 23 of the Gender Recognition Act. So when they brought in the Gender Recognition Act, they knew it was a completely unprecedented law to say that you could change your sex for all purposes. They didn't know what that would mean in real life. And so they put in this Section 23, which basically says, if we run into any problems, we can sort them out later. So Section 23 gives the Secretary of State the power to change any other enactment which mentions sex by order. So they don't need to open up the whole law for debate. They can do it by a statutory instrument. So they write an order, they lay it before Parliament. It has to be laid before Parliament for 40 days. And if it's not disagreed with, then it becomes law. So it's quite a sort of surgical way of changing the law. And we think they can use this Section 23 to change this little bit of the Equality Act to make clear that the protected characteristic of sex means sex, without opening up the rest of the Equality Act for debate, which would be dangerous. So that's the thing the petition's asking for: change the Equality Act so that male, female, man, woman, and sex are not modified by a gender recognition certificate. And that would allow there to be two clear, separate protected characteristics, one that protects everyone against sex discrimination and one that protects everyone who identifies as transgender from gender reassignment discrimination. And that doesn't mean, that discrimination doesn't mean not being treated as the opposite sex. It means that you shouldn't lose your job for being trans. You shouldn't be refused service in a restaurant or on a plane. You shouldn't be refused entry to university or school, for example, but not that you should be treated as the opposite sex. And it may sometimes mean that there has to be alternative provision, because, where anytime you separate people into two streams, male and female, that's going to make life difficult for people who are transgender. And so often there are ways around that, provide a unisex option. But the important thing is that the law is clear that sex and gender reassignment are two separate characteristics and the protections are separate. So if this gets changed, it will make it simpler for service providers to understand the law, and it will make it clearer for them to explain their rules to service users. We think it will enable, when these kind of cases come to court, there'll be better judgments, and it'll prevent the kind of bad judgments like the one at Sheffield Hospital, where a trans woman who was allowed to go into the women's showers and changing rooms and who was half naked then complained of sexual harassment when his manager asked him why he was half naked in the women's changing rooms. That was sexual harassment of the trans woman. So, being clear about who's a man and who's a woman will avoid those kind of bad judgments. But what it won't do, and we don't want to overclaim, is it won't automatically outlaw policies like putting trans women into women's prisons, because the government has done that through a different mechanism. But it will make it clearer and easier for other kinds of service providers to say clearly, we have a men's, we have a women's, we have unisex, we cater for everybody, and we're not getting into this discussion. So this is where we are so far. We hopefully, I haven't checked my phone, we might have hit 30,000, no, not yet, but maybe by the end of the call, 30,000 signatures today. I think we'll get it by the end of today, which is amazing. You can see the map of where people are signing. There's about the map is done. They have it two ways. One is by number of signatures and one is by percentage of the electorate. And if you look at percentage of the electorate, it's about double the rate in Scotland as it is in England, because this is a sort of backstop to the self-ID, which the Scottish government is threatening to bring in. So that's obviously concentrating people's minds in Scotland. And we promised early on that the constituency that ends up with the highest number of signatures will come and do an event there. And as you can see on the map, Edinburgh's looking like it's going to win so far. So that's where we are. And there. And we need to get to 100,000 people in order to have a parliamentary debate on this, a Westminster Hall debate. So that a Westminster Hall debate doesn't decide anything, but it airs the arguments in Parliament, and it allows both sides to air the arguments, and it will allow it will basically allow the Helen Staniland question to be asked in a parliamentary debate. All of these debates about the Gender Recognition Act and gender recognition in the Equality Act were never asked with women in mind. So they never said, does this mean that someone with a penis will be allowed into women's showers? If we get a debate in Parliament, we'll be able to ask those questions. So we need to get to 70,000 people in the next 164 days. You get 6 months to run these petitions. We'd like it to be quicker than that, but that's the bottom line. which means getting at least 427 people sign each day. Currently, we're at 631 today, but when I wrote these slides, but we'd like to speed it up. So this is our plan. This is what we're doing. We've set up petition champions, so people can sign up with Sex Matters and they'll get emails fairly regularly with ideas, resources, encouragement, that kind of thing, to try and get the people who are willing to be multipliers to get, you know, 5 people, 10 people, 20 people to sign up. And then we'll be putting out resources, stories, social media, video, everything to just kind of keep it top of mind and try and get it beyond the Twitter population, because I think we've probably, you know, we've reached the top of the people who really understand what we're talking about and will sign anything we ask them to. And so we have to get beyond that to the vast majority of people who are sympathetic to this, but it's a bit techie. So that's what we will be doing over the next however long it takes. And we'd really like Women's Rights Network members to get involved, both individually, so like come to the website, sign up, be a champion, get your friends to do it, but also we've come on this call to sort of ask you what kinds of resources, what would help you, and then also maybe to plant the idea that WRN as a group might want to pick up this petition and promote it in your own work. So those are kind of the 3 things. And I think eventually we'll turn this over to open discussion, but Helen, have you been watching the chat, and are there Q&As that are worth recording?
What I thought I'd do first is, just having listened to you, things that I thought I could add, as clarifications as the sort of the non-expert on this. So one thing people are probably wondering is why this, when it seems so techie, like the sorts of things that we all want to say is it's ridiculous, you can't change sex, don't let people change their birth certificates, abolish the Gender Recognition Act and so on. And it's not that anyone here would disagree with you. It's that this is a surgical thing that is actually within our reach, and that can be done, and that can be done during this government. And it's something that can be done with the sorts of resources that we have to hand. There's a lot of good things to do with this. It's mainly a sort of a risk reduction thing. This question of whether the Equality Act by sex means what's written on your birth certificate, including a birth certificate that's been modified, that question's bound to come to court sometime. And if it does, there's a really serious risk that a judge who isn't thinking through what this actually means, who isn't thinking of a male person in front of them, a male body, a person that everybody knows is a man, is thinking of, the way they always get women to play trans women in films. They're thinking of a woman. And so they might make the wrong decision. So this one will forestall a big risk. It's very important for Scotland because Scotland is actually looking more dicey than I would have said it could possibly 2 weeks ago. I would have said it was a completely done deal. But if they get gender self-ID in Scotland, and the Equality Act, which is UK-wide and is reserved to Westminster, makes it extremely clear that what it says in the Equality Act means sex, not sex as modified. That's obviously a really important backstop. If they end up with gender self-ID, it still means that the comparator in an employment case and so on will be someone of the opposite sex. I think that it fits within a broader concept, which is how Sex Matters thinks that it can add to the current push, because there's lots of different groups doing lots of interesting and excellent things, and each one has its own specialty. And one of the things that we're really able to do is, these sort of careful, hopefully quite clever legal things that reduce risks, that clarify things. Anyone who's ever tried to explain to an employer or a head teacher what the difference is between sex and gender reassignment, and how the Equality Act allows you to exclude everybody of the wrong sex from a single sex space, but you've got to use 2 different arguments depending on whether the person has a gender recognition certificate or not. Everyone who's had that experience will know it's miserable, and it'd be easier just to say sex means sex, single sex space means single sex space. So this, for a lot of reasons, this is a particularly useful thing to do, even if people would have preferred, something much bigger. And the final thing I'd say is that Stonewall and the Scottish government both say that they don't think that a gender recognition certificate changes your sex for the purpose of the Equality Act, but that's because they think that having the protected characteristic of gender reassignment does. So they play this bait and switch where they say, whenever you say sex should mean sex, they say, yes, we agree with you. And you're like, well, then what are you going on about? I mean, basically, they think the gender recognition certificate's pretty much nothing. They think gender reassignment is everything. But that could be useful for us. It's hard for them to argue against us because they already say that what we say is right. They just have a very different reason for saying it. And their reason isn't well based in law. Let me have a look through the questions now. A leaflet to explain the purpose of the petition and encourage people to sign. That's on our plans, isn't it, Maya?
Yeah.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, as Maya said, we're reaching the limit of the people who don't need any of this explained. So yes. Next one. Is the term biological sex not open to debate in regard to how everyone will understand the meaning?
Well, we've heard this one on Twitter a bit. So one thing we will do is a sort of series of frequently asked questions. We don't think this is a problem because we're just saying the difference between the sex that is on your birth certificate when you were born, which is your biological sex, and sex as modified by a gender recognition certificate. There is no other option. And so, as Helen said, the trans rights organizations have been trying to say that your sex can change just because you self-ID. But there was a really important and similarly kind of surgical step back in May this year when Lord True made a statement to the Houses of Parliament, making clear that there are only two possible meanings of sex in any piece of legislation. One is your biological sex, and the other is sex modified by gender recognition certificate. So all the kind of nonsense arguments we hear on Twitter don't fly legally. And that happened because of, if you remember the MoMA debate where about maternity leave in Parliament, which was the first time really any MPs and Lords had discussed this. And so just by sort of unpacking it and getting them to say, what does mother mean? Why can't we say mother in a law about maternity leave? Or can we say mother in a law about maternity leave? It made them unpick this and say, okay, what does sex mean? And what they came to was it either means biological sex or sex as modified by a gender recognition certificate. So if we can knock out that second option with regard to the Equality Act, then we're left with biological sex, and there really isn't a question about what that means.
There's a really good question, which is what is the potential unintended consequence of this? I mean, the worst thing is that they debate this and they decide against us, but we have talked about this internal to Sex Matters. Maya may have some other thoughts on this too. Honestly, that's going to happen if we don't stop it. That's going to happen anyway. There's going to be a legal case and the judge is not going to know what he's talking about. So, you know, the downside risk of this is less, I think, than leaving it to some idiot judge to decide. Maya?
Yes, I think that's right. And this is, you know, the other options are go to the European Court of Human Rights, but that takes much longer and it's much more expensive and it's much less democratic. I mean, I think everyone agrees with the principle that this should be debated in Parliament, that it should be up to Parliament to say what it is the laws say and mean. So I think, you know, from that point of view, there isn't a downside in having it democratically debated because we want it democratically debated, and we think that we should win. And part of the reason we think we should win is there are all the arguments about trans women not being women, but there's also an argument about trans men and sex discrimination. So someone like Freddie McConnell, the woman who has a gender recognition certificate, so legally her birth certificate says she's a man, but she got pregnant, had a baby, and wanted to be recorded as the father on the baby's birth certificate. And she went to court and she lost. And they said, no, a mother is the person who gives birth to a child, and that person is necessarily female, even if their birth certificate has changed. And so one of the arguments is somebody like Freddie McConnell could face sex discrimination because of breastfeeding, because of getting pregnant, because of being a fertile woman of a certain age, because the people that she works with know that she's a woman and may discriminate against her on that basis, even if she says she's a man. And she shouldn't lose that protection against sex discrimination and against sexual harassment because of having a gender recognition certificate. So, and that argument has never been made in Parliament. They just didn't think it through. They didn't think that they'd be giving gender recognition certificates to women who said they're men and who went ahead and had babies, but their laws allowed them to do that. And so now they have to deal with the consequences of that, which is you don't want to take away the sex discrimination protection for someone like Freddie McConnell.
I think I was a little unfair when I said idiot judge. I didn't mean that judges are idiot. I meant that a judge rules on what's in front of them. And what happens when activists bring cases, and we've seen this in America with the bathroom bills and that, is they wait until the right case comes along. So the ACLU left a bunch of trans girls, as in boys who wanted to get into girls' changing rooms, go past until they found a trans boy, a girl who was deluded enough to say she wanted to use the boys' changing rooms. And they used that case. And it's really clear if you read the transcripts of the court hearings that it never triggered judges thinking, hang on, you're telling a boy to go into the girls' changing rooms. And so they actually won in the Fourth Circuit, and that one's heading probably on its way to the Supreme Court. So what we don't want is to end up with some very passable trans woman arguing that really she is, you know, a woman for all intents and purposes, and the judge never gets to hear because there's nobody to put it in front of them and there's no moment to do it. Well, what about actual women like Freddie McConnell? You know, if somebody sacks Freddie for having a baby, do you want to say that she's not actually discriminated against? So when you debate things in the round in a parliamentary debate, or when you're thinking about changing a law and there's 40 days that people can put forward submissions, there's a chance for all these things to be said for the first time, and much less risk of like the perfect case to bamboozle one judge into making this decision for us.
Yeah, there's another question in here. What about the phrase under direct discrimination about being perceived to be? Could a trans woman argue that they're perceived to be a woman and therefore claim the protection women have? Yes, and it's not a bad thing. So if if this passing trans woman in any particular circumstance was discriminated against as a woman, then they could claim sex discrimination. So if a trans woman went into a pub and the publican said, "No women in here, love," they could claim sex discrimination because they're being discriminated against as a woman. But that doesn't mean that they can claim entry into something that really is for women. It doesn't work both ways. So there's a discrimination by protection, by perception in relation to religion, for example. You know, if somebody thinks you're Jewish because you have a Jewish name or you look Jewish, and they discriminate against you on that basis, then you're protected. But it doesn't mean that you have a right to a place in a Jewish school, which has its own rules, which really decide who's Jewish. So that it's not necessarily a bad thing, that one.
I mean, the canonical example of that is gay bashing. So, you know, if you've got a man who's dressed rather flamboyantly and he goes out and people assume that he's gay and beat him up, but actually he's straight, and then it's brought with a hate crime aggravator that it was homophobic crime, they can't say, well, actually he was straight, so get rid of the hate crime aggravator. No, it's right. What they were doing was homophobia, even though he wasn't a gay man. So it's not a problem if there is this legendary passing trans woman and she's discriminated against for being a woman. It doesn't mean that she thereby gains entry to, you know, a girls' only school or anything like that. It's just, that's the way discrimination law works, and that's all well thought through. I don't see any other questions in the chat for now. There's loads of good suggestions.
If it doesn't hit 100K, who in government is likely to respond? And there's kind of two sides to that. Even if it does hit 100K, you're considered for a debate, and we think we will get a debate, but we also have to do a bunch of work behind the scenes to make sure that that debate has somebody to lead it, you know, ideally from the Conservative Party because they're in government, and has politicians from other parties to also you know, so that you have a good debate and not just a debate where no one shows up, so that you have the kind of political energy behind it. And we're doing that work behind the scenes. So you know, it's a pincer movement, and we think we will get 100k and we will get the political energy. And then if you don't get 100k and you have the political energy, you can have the debate anyway.
Somebody tells about wanting to set up a women's staff network in a local authority, and the legal department saying that it wasn't trans inclusive and so it didn't meet the requirements of the exemptions. These things happen all the time. You should have been allowed to do that. I can't promise that us, you know, clarifying the law in this particular way will help with it, but it's really clear that the ambiguity is sufficient that people are able to cite whatever they like and get away with it, and that the lobby groups have had the room that they want to argue one way in one situation and the other way in the other situation, and you look around and everything's gone. There are no women in law anymore somehow, although that was not what was intended, and no internally consistent argument could get you there with British law as it is. So it's just better. It's better if it means what it should mean, and you can say it with absolute clarity that it does. So, you know, that would just be easier to go back to an employer or, you know, a service provider and say, no, see, they amended it to make clear that what I say is right. There really is such a thing as biological sex in law, and there really is possibility of being a woman-only space. Will TRAs lobby in some sort of way, and is Mumsnet helping with signing?
Mumsnet is definitely helping. There's a active WhatsApp. I mean, there's an active group in the women's rights bit of Mumsnet. Mumsnet institutionally isn't particularly helping or not helping, but that's fine. So far the TRAs haven't picked up on it. We're kind of hoping they do, because it helps with publicity. They're in a bit of a bind because the TRA lawyers and Stonewall have already said that a gender recognition certificate doesn't affect the Equality Act. So it's quite hard for them to say that we're now trying to take away their rights by saying, let's just be clear about that. But it'd be quite nice to have people on the other side. It would be good in Parliament to have people on the other side saying, of course somebody with a penis should be allowed into women's spaces. This is exactly what we want. You know,
it's a beautiful womanly penis.
Yes, those arguments need to be aired, because so many, you know, sort of ordinary people who are not paying attention to this just think that's so ridiculous. That's not what they're asking for, but it is.
So somebody asks, Maya, whether what this will do if we get this, when you do have one of those blokes who has a certificate saying that he's female, will this help in any way? Is there any way of keeping that man out of women-only spaces if he has a piece of paper saying he's a woman?
Yes, I mean, I think that the details of different kinds of situations depend on the kind of situation. So there are the sort of easiest ones to police are the ones where you know the person's identity and you can control the space. So workplaces, and it's interesting that there have been very few cases about toilets and changing rooms. They just haven't come to court, and the only one that did come to court was a workplace one. So it was a case where the employers knew that this person was a man transitioning to a woman, and all his colleagues knew. So it wasn't about somebody trying to sort of get by unnoticed. It was about what was the rule. Were they going to enforce a rule that forced the women to share a space with him, or were they going to say to him, no, you know, we recognize you're a lovely trans woman, but you've got to use the unisex because your colleagues also have rights. And those kinds of cases are going to be the ones that where the principles are made. And then, you know, places where no one's policing it, no one's going to be policing it anyway. But if you can shift the norm to say it's fine for a service provider to say no, and it's fine for a service provider to say, look, we've got a unisex space, so there's nothing else for you to complain about, then it kind of shifts the norm everywhere.
So we've never policed who can come into single sex spaces. It's always been, you know, that everybody knows how the rules work. And what's changed over the past 10 years is that the legal confusion, the lobbying group and so on, have meant that when men who claim to be women go into women's spaces, it's very hard to know what to do about it. And if you complain to to the company or the service provider or your employer or whatever, you don't know that you'll get the backing that you need. And so just, you know, the more clarity, the better, because we're going to have to re-win the ground that we've lost. And it'd be quite painful, I have to say, and slow. Last thing before we turn off the recording, so that we can actually just have a chat and hear what your ideas are. Somebody suggests Women's Institute, and as they point out in the chat, the different chapters are very different and differently run. So I suspect this may be one to do personally. This may be one that people who know a chapter or are willing to reach out to one. Why painful and slow? Because we've lost so much ground and these buggers are going to take hand-to-hand fighting to push back. That's why.
People are asking schools and colleges and guidance for employers too. I mean, they are all service providers, but how can we make that clear that everybody is covered by the same set of rules?
I think, I think what will happen is it'll get tested in certain places, and then the norms will be extended. So I think, you know, the sign that says little man with trousers and little woman with a skirt can't mean different things in a university, a school, a swimming pool, and a shopping centre. It has to mean the same thing everywhere. So if you can prove that it means one thing in the gym, then it has to mean the same thing in a school. And the good thing about schools are, and also workplaces, they actually have requirements that you have to have separate sex facilities. It's not just that you can, but you have to. So there are sort of different levers to pull in different places, and they all help each other, because the expectation that the word and the sign means something has to be consistent across all these different places.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's really interesting.